To reiterate from yesterday in section 14.1, you should know just the top three from this table. So for the whole Earth, we've got iron, then oxygen, then silicon. You don't necessarily need to know percentages, just in general. These are big elements when we're talking about mining or accessing things within the Earth. So we've got the whole Earth, again, iron, oxygen, silicon, and in the crust, that's a little bit different. There's oxygen, then silicon, then aluminum. The reason that iron takes a big leap when we're talking about the entire Earth is that we think that some of the molten rock and some of the liquid that's inside the Earth is liquid iron. So that's why we think there's more iron there. Okay. We'll come back and talk about some of the basics of these. You don't have to know the order like I mentioned yesterday, but you'll need to know some of the characteristics of them, but we'll talk about that later after you guys do some mass extinction stuff and look at that. So Earth's resources. One of the biggest things that people fight over is resources. So one of those is all of the metal. Metal's really valuable because it can be versatile, it can do a lot of different things, and it's also available in limited quantities. So if you guys remember from history, metals are so important that different eras or different time frames are actually known by what metal was used or fought over at the time. So you've got like the Bronze Age versus the Stone Age, okay? So in general, you should just know that's why people fight about metal and why it's important. For a lot of metals, bigger countries or more developed countries are the ones that use them. So the US, Japan, and then a lot of Europe. And then a lot of the metals that we need are not mined in the US, or they're mined other places and in developing countries. So they tend to be mined in China. Russia has a lot of land. Canada has a lot of land. We do mine some things still in the US. Okay. When we're talking about fossil fuels, this is something that we touched on briefly in the energy unit, but you should know how we go from plants to coal. So remember, anthracite was the coal that has the highest energy content. So when we're talking about the progression of fossil fuels, we go from plants to peat, to lignite, to bituminous, to anthracite. And those last three are all types of coal. Anthracite just has the highest energy content. And peat is kind of the predecessor or the forerunner of coal in and of itself. Okay. You can take a look at this. This talks about rare earth minerals. That's one of the minerals that people fight about the most. You don't really have to take notes from this stuff, but you can just look at it because it's kind of interesting. And sometimes the FRQ questions will pull from current events or things that are newer in the news. So it helps to read those case studies. You should know how coal and oil forms. And we kind of talked about this already, again, with the energy unit, but we're going back to it because we're talking about resources within the Earth. So coal requires that a lot of plant matter accumulates. And then with time and pressure and heat, we go from peat to lignite to coal. And it's the heat and pressure that make a coal hard and dense. Okay. Generally, in order to get coal, it requires a lot of swampland. So coal can be found underneath some of our current swamps, or it's found in places where there used to be a swamp at some point. Okay. When we're talking about oil, this is an example of what this might look like. You may remember that we talked about the fact that oil tends to be found in a lot of marine environments or places where there used to be a marine environment, because it tends to come more from algae and plankton. So time and pressure and heat as the algae and plankton die cause us to go from algae and plankton to oil. And oil, remember, has to be trapped in an area where it can't drain from. So it can be found in porous rock. Sometimes there's rock that contains oil, but it has to be trapped above a layer that it can't sift through or filter through because it is a liquid. Okay. When we're talking about different types of resources, you should know, just as an example, some of the, since we talked about, let's see, oxygen, and then silicon and aluminum being the most common elements in the Earth's crust. Aluminum, as an example, comes from bauxite. Okay, it's a bauxite ore. So when we talk about extracting ore and mining ore, we're not mining pure aluminum. We have to get the rock and then take it from the rock. Okay. Do you remember what electrolysis is? Maybe? Yeah, passing a current through something. So with the water, when you pass a current through it, that causes it to split into hydrogen and oxygen gas. When you use electrolysis with bauxite, then that allows us to extract aluminum from the ore. But a lot of extraction requires a lot of energy, so it's not very efficient. So doing things like recycling can actually be easier or cheaper than extracting it from pure ore or from the minerals. So this is an example of how much energy it takes to recycle things versus getting it from the rock itself. Okay, so aluminum was an example of that. If we can substitute where we get our resources from, that helps lower costs and it lowers demand. So that supply and demand, I guess, relationship is different than if we only extract it from ore and we get it brand new. Okay. 14.3, environmental effects and resource extraction. So there's a bunch of different types of mining that you should just kind of be familiar with, looking at kind of pros and cons. Really, there are just some specific cons that go with each of them. So we've already talked about mountaintop removal. That was in the case study in section 1. But you should know underground mining, open pit mining, and then surface or strip mining. Okay. And there are laws that regulate what kind of mining we do in the country. We'll talk more about laws later, because you will have to be familiar with certain laws, but not right now. When we process stuff, there's byproduct from that. So some of the processing, actually almost all of it, produces sulfur. So you need to know why sulfur is so commonly produced with coal. Pretty much sulfur is found in coal, and depending on the kind of coal, you'll have more sulfur than others. And to remove the coal, something that a plant can install is called a scrubber. So it helps pull the sulfur from the air before it's released. So the sulfur is not released as a pollutant. Okay, you need to know heap leach extraction. So these types of extractions are listed over here. Heap leach is pretty much used to help extract metals from an ore. So the ore gets sprayed, and I will pause there.